Hello, everyone. Welcome to This Week in Economics with Robert Wenzel. I'm Robert Wenzel. This week's topic is why the velocity of money is a useless concept. Now, this concept comes up this week because of an email that I received from Tom Nalepa. Tom writes, would you possibly consider doing a podcast video that addresses the fallacy of money velocity with respect to inflation? I have read some Mises and Rothbard on this topic. However, I'm still struggling with explaining the velocity fallacy in a pithy way that might challenge a Keynesian or mainstreamer, non economist type to rethink their belief increased money velocity is necessary to feel the effects of inflation, or believing that money is like water moving through economic plumbing. Ideally, I would like to deliver an explanation that is on a par with an elevator pitch in duration or shorter if possible. Well, Tom, if you're looking for the elevator pitch, it's simple. Ask them if they've ever looked at the data, and then ask them if money velocity is necessary for increasing inflation, then how do they explain the period of 2005 to 2009 when we had decreasing velocity and increasing inflation? They can't explain it. As a matter of fact, you just by looking at velocity can't tell you anything at all with regard to whether you're going to have more inflation or less inflation. In the 1970s, you had velocity going up and you had price inflation. In the 1990s, you had velocity uh, also climbing, but you had lower prices. And then you had this period of 2005 to 2009 when you had velocity dropping and you had prices increasing. So just throw that at them. They're definitely not looking at the numbers. They just have some concept in their mind that is not in touch with reality. But the concept of the velocity of money is a much more interesting concept that I want to delve into how it developed and why it's around and why it really is meaningless. So let's start with that. And I want to start specifically with an economist by the name of Friedrich Hayek, who wrote in 1952 a book called The Counter-Revolution of Science. And in that book, he argued that economists were using the methods of the physical sciences, mimicking the physical sciences in the science of economics, which was a different kind of science. Um, Physics is not the same as economics. The physical sciences are different from the social sciences. Now, I happen to agree with him. I think what's really going on is that economists have what I call an inferior, mainstream economists have an inferiority complex, and they would like to be like the physicists and be able to predict exact numbers and exact data and all that kind of thing, where it can't be done. So they have this inferiority complex. They make equations that don't make any sense, and it's math envy, it's physics envy, and I urge anyone who wants to understand more about the differences between the methodology of economics and of the social sciences and the methodology of the physical sciences to pick up Hayek's Counter Revolution of Science. Now, the idea of some kind of velocity of money has been around for a long time. As a matter of fact, the historian, economic historian, economist, and economic historian Joseph Schumpeter, in his book on the history of economic thought, pointed out that Bernardo Davanzetti, who lived from 1529 to 1606, actually had a uh, a crude kind of velocity of money theory. But the modern day money velocity theory came about because of an economist, Irving Fisher, who wrote a book called The Purchasing Power of Money. He wrote it in 1911. And in that, he talked about something called the velocity of circulation. Now, since then, it's called the velocity of money, but it's the basic same um, concept. And he developed an equation. Here comes the inferiority complex. He developed an equation um, Sometimes it's known as the MV equals PT. Sometimes it's called MV equals PQ. They're essentially the same thing. MV equals PT is a little bit easier to understand, where you've got M, which is the money supply, V is the velocity, uh, P is the number of transactions in a period, and P is the average price of those transactions. So that's MV equals PT. Now, the next important discussion of this comes about by Schumpeter himself in 1954 in his History of Economic Analysis, where he does talk about the development of the velocity of money. And it's key there because he does use the term velocity of money. From there, it goes on to the famous book on the history of United States money by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, called A Monetary History in the United States, 1867 to 1960. The book was written in 1963, and Friedman and Schwartz also use the concept of velocity of money. And this is interesting because they're generally thinking of um, velocity as a constant, but they understand there's variations. They argue that during a boom period, the velocity of money tends to increase a little bit. During a bust period, they argue that the uh, velocity of money tends to fall, and then they talk about a um, a general decline in the concept of money supply in from roughly one level to the next, dropping by one every year or so, by 1%. So they had a sort of a narrow range where they thought there was kind of a constant, but they also um, looked at it in terms of some variation. Now that variation disappeared for a while, and people started thinking of the velocity of money as a constant. For example, there's a 1998 paper, May of 1998, written by Federal Reserve economists. It's called P-Star Revisited Money-Based Inflation Forecast with a Changing Equilibrium Velocity. And they allude to the idea that people have been uh, holding the view that velocity of money is a constant. They write, we find that while a P-star model assuming a constant equilibrium velocity does not provide accurate inflation forecast in the 1990s. So it's right there, right? You're seeing it. And then most remarkable is that um, even after these periods when really it's obvious that money supply is jumping around, um, you have Greg Mankiw, who's a Harvard professor, who is the number one economics textbook uh, seller in the United States. His book is the most used book by college students in Economics 101. In his book, Principles of Macroeconomics, the fifth edition, published in 2008, he writes, the velocity of money is relatively stable over time. So he's still using this idea of a constant, stable velocity of money. And they do this because they want to be able to predict things. If you basically have the quantity of goods the same, and uh, you increase the amount of money and the velocity is the same, then you're going to be able to predict what the price level is going to be. So basically, that's behind the idea that they want to hold the velocity constant, so they can sort of fulfill their uh, physics envy and be able to make predictions. Of course, uh, the price level doesn't have to be the same uh, because you're always getting changes in the quantity of goods, the productivity with regard to the goods you're purchasing, and it's a world, it's always changing. So you don't really have this kind of neat scenario where you can make these exact forecasts. And that's what they want, because they really want to be physicists. They want to set the set off a rocket and be able to predict what's going on. So, anyways, that's what's really going on with the actual creation of this equation. Now let's look at the idea of velocity itself. Uh, General thinking about the concept of velocity. Let's go to a dictionary. Let's go. I pulled the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and they talk of three different definitions that are very much the same: quickness of motion, speed; rapidity of movement; speed imparted to something. Now, if you delve into uh, books on physics, which discuss velocity, they're going to take it in a more detailed way and say it's time over space, some object moving time over a given piece of land or whatever it might be. So let's um, let's take that apart a little bit and show you how it's different from what economists are doing with their velocity. The velocity, when talked about by physicists, gives you sort of an immediate sense for what's going on. For example, if you follow baseball very closely, if you are told that a pitcher has a velocity on his ball of 99 miles per hour, you know that's very, very hard throwing pitcher. That's going to be hard for the batter to hit the ball because he's going to have very quick reflexes, very good eyesight because that ball's going to go by really, really fast. On the other hand, if the velocity is 75 miles per hour, pitch is throwing at 75 miles per hour, you're going to know that's a lot slower. It's going to be a little bit easier for the batter to hit the ball. So you basically have a situation where the velocity number tells you something in baseball immediately. You get an immediate sense. You know what it means in terms of the real world and what that means. If it was ever a case where there was a pitcher who could throw the ball at 150 miles per hour, then it would be extremely, extremely difficult for a batter to hit that. It wouldn't happen. So the number tells you something that you can relate to in terms of the real world. Now, same thing, you can apply it to spaceships going into outer space. In order to break through the atmosphere of the United States, which is called escape velocity, you need to be a spaceship has to be traveling at 25,000 miles per hour. So instinctively, you know, if someone tells you a spaceship is going at 35,000 uh, miles per hour or 50,000 miles per hour, you know it's going to be able to break through the atmosphere and head into outer space. On the other hand, if you get a rocket ship that for some reason is going at the speed of a car, which is 60 miles per hour, you know it's not going to get through the atmosphere. Okay, 60 miles per hour. So instinctively, you know what these numbers mean and all that. That is not the case with the velocity number. If I tell you the velocity is 3, what does that mean? If I tell you the velocity is increasing or decreasing, what does that mean? If I tell you the velocity is increasing of money, you don't know if that means there's a price inflation or not. If I tell you that there's been a change, that velocity has gone up or velocity has gone down, same thing. That doesn't tell you anything about prices. You actually need to know what's going on with prices, what's going on um, with money supply and transactions and all that kind of stuff, independent of the velocity number, to understand what's going on. The velocity number is a useless concept in and of itself. It's created only by economists who have uh, mathematical envy. They want to be physicists that can predict exact things. And so they come up with these equations where there's emptiness in part of the equation that doesn't fit reality. It doesn't tell us things the way the uh, equation, a velocity equation in the physical sciences does. So be aware, not going to tell you anything, not useful, just weak economists not understanding how rich and complex and interesting true economics is. They have to go out and mimic physicists and come up with these silly concepts. Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my website, economicpolicyjournal.com, where I talk about the economy Monday through Friday. I post there about economic policy, economic theory, economic personalities. And then I don't stop. I do more posting on Saturday and Sunday. It's every day of the week. It's economicpolicyjournal.com. As far as these feature podcasts, This Week in Economics, I post them on Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 8 a.m. Whoops, let's back up on that. 11 a.m. Eastern time, 8 a.m. Pacific time. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.